Well, we're just about at a 3-digit threshold, so let's get rolling. Panelists, everyone give me a thumbs up. Are you all feeling good and ready to go? All right, great. Welcome to Suburban Hip, the next wave of growth and a new way of life in the suburbs. Thanks everybody for joining us today as we explore an increasing shift towards suburban living. Residents, both young, old, and every age in between, are seeking a new imagined experience in the suburbs. And we want to explore today, why is that? And more importantly, how do we successfully complete that? My name is Jessica Rossi. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'm a planner and a real estate economist out of Kimley-Horn, Charlotte, North Carolina office. I work on market feasibility and economic development studies across the country, and I've personally experienced a growing momentum in mixed use or multi-use development opportunities in suburban locations. And what I'm seeing is an undeniable interest in delivering well-designed projects that offer the best of both worlds: urban excitement and connection, and suburban quality of life. So before we begin with the new, let's think back maybe 15 or 20 years. What was your perception of suburban living at that time? As a student planner in my graduate program, we spent a lot of time talking about the challenges that suburbs offered. Places that looked very much like the top image on the screen now. Limited connection in terms of land uses, auto-oriented mindsets that often resulted in increased congestion, long commutes, and maybe a lack of identity. We always said, there's no there. And those are all things that we discussed, and they're things that are relevant here today. So with that being said, what's driving, not only a resurgence in suburban development, but also a reinvention? And the short answer to that is demographics. So let's start with the millennials, as we usually do. This group is currently aged 23 to 39, and it includes over 72 million people nationally. And that age range, I'll say it again, 23 to 39, is really important here. A decade ago, there were no millennials that were over the age of 30. Now nearly half of them are. They're entering that stage of life where they are settling down. Maybe they're forming families, they're buying homes. And despite their best efforts, maybe they're turning into their parents a little bit. There's a sizable wave of buyers that are about to enter the housing market for the first time, and they want it all. They want quality housing options. They want quality of life, including, high-performing school districts, and they want quality amenities. On the other end of the spectrum are the active adults, and they're driving demand for locations that offer centralized housing services, entertainment, recreation, shopping, dining, all that great stuff. And if their grandbabies are nearby, all the better. Overall, users are prioritizing the desire for walkability, sociability, healthy living, and sustainability. And would it really be a real estate conversation without mentioning COVID? The data that we're seeing strongly suggests that while the demographic trends were already making waves in the suburbs, COVID has really accelerated that interest because we're balancing healthy living with more space, especially if we're stuck in our houses 24/7, and an urban style feel and amenities. So before I ask our very patient panelists to introduce themselves, I did want to make a quick note from a housekeeping perspective. We have lots of questions that are teed up, and we certainly have lots of information to share, but I really want to encourage our audience to join in the fun. There's a Q&A window, and you can, we encourage you to, put in a question, comments. We are wanting to incorporate what you want to learn about into this panel today. So with that being said, let's dive in. So to start, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to share a little bit about themselves, including why out of a firm of more than 4,500 people, you're sitting in the shared hot seat today. What's your specific interest and experience in suburban development? So we'll start with Eric Bosman. The virtual stage is yours.
Thanks, Jessica. So my name is Eric Bosman. I'm an urban designer and planner based in Atlanta, Georgia. And I've had the opportunity to work both in Metro Houston, Metro Atlanta, and growing metropolitan areas across the Southeast and Midwest over the last 25 years. Much of my career has been about trying to find this sense of place that Jessica spoke about, thinking about places that were designed around the automobile and how do we make them more active, more connected, more walkable, and frankly, more sustainable, whether you're looking at that from an environmental or from a market standpoint.
Great. What about you, Ryan?
Hi, I'm Ryan McMaster. I'm a development services civil engineer in our Nashville office. And over the last 20 years or so of my career, my practice has been heavily focused in many mixed use and suburban residential developments. As a resident of the city of Franklin, which is just south of Nashville, most of my practice has been focused down in Williamson County in the city of Franklin on mixed use developments. And we'll touch a little bit later, I think, on some of those specific details and projects that I've spent a lot of my time. But I think as a resident of a suburban area, I really am passionate about creating these there places that we can all go visit, take our families, and experience the in-town living in a suburban market.
Excellent. Leo?
Hello, everybody. My name is Leo O'Brien. I'm a landscape architect and community designer, and I've been able to have work done on the East Coast and spent most of my career in the West Coast working on several communities of various densities and types and styles, and just I feel very privileged to be a part of these great teams that have built places for people to live, to create memories, to move around and make friends, and really have places that are viable. And so I'm very excited to be a part of this panel and look forward to talking with you more. Thank you.
And last but not least, Amy.
I'm Amy Wicks, and I am in our Fort Myers office. I have a unique background. I'm an ecological engineer, but my background before that was I was really focused on surface water and water quality. I got involved in an awesome project back in 2006, Babcock Ranch, down here close to Fort Myers, Florida, in Southwest Florida. And as part of getting involved in that early on, it was a sustainable community was the thought. And it was really before sustainability was a big buzzword as far as communities go and everything. And I got involved and became really passionate about the overall vision and went back to school, got my ecological engineering master's. And I'm still working on that project today as it continues to develop and evolve.
Excellent. Well, now that we know our panelists a little better, let's dive into some content. Let's start with walkability. Walkability is arguably one of the key planning and design focuses of the new suburban urban community. What is walkable suburbanism, and what trends from urban cities are being applied to these reimagined communities? Eric, I feel like you would have a good answer to this one.
Yeah, so I sort of want to start by adding on to the history lesson that you started with. I mean, I don't think we can talk about suburban evolution without really going back to the late 1800s, if you can believe it or not. The notion, the idea of suburbs really dates back to London in the late 1800s. And there was a seminal piece of work developed by an urban planner named Ebenezer Howard that sort of coined the idea of this garden city. What the suburbs were originally intended to be were sort of this combination of the best of the city and the best of the country. And I think that notion of what a suburb is hasn't necessarily changed in terms of its philosophy over a century plus now. But I think what did change, particularly in the United States, by the time we got to developing our suburbs, particularly in the southern half of the country, we had the automobile. And so that notion of what the best of the city and the best of the country was was very much shaped by the access that the automobile provided in the 1950s, 1960s, up through about the 1980s. And so what we got in the United States and the Sun Belt wasn't so much the garden city as it was the bedroom community. I mean, that's the challenge, as you talked about when we were back in graduate school, Jessica. The challenge that we faced is we really had bedroom communities that were alive from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and then from 6 a.m. to maybe 8 a.m. and then everybody left and went to work and came back home in the evenings to sleep. And really what we're seeing now is that the notion of what the best of the city and the best of the country is just looks a lot different now than it did from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the premise of that, I think, really is both experience and, to your question, finally, walkability. Because what people want now, what that notion of the best of the city and the best of the country is a place where you can walk from home to go grab dinner or a drink or an ice cream or a slice of pizza, where you can go out, not in COVID times, but as we were leading into COVID, now I think what we're going to see in spades coming out of COVID is people just wanting to be around other people. But as you mentioned, when it's families with children, when it's seniors, that doesn't mean being around tens of thousands of people. Sometimes that means being around tens of people, or maybe hundreds of people in a place that's more familial, in a place that feels more like a hometown atmosphere. So I think ultimately what we're seeing in sort of this new wave of suburban development that's been going on for probably 20 years now, and that we're going to continue to see more of, is this notion that our suburban downtowns in particular need to be walkable. They need to be a little more in intensity and experience than what our traditional downtowns were, that they're more connected. Because what people want to do is they want to be able to go out for that stroll. They want to be able to access goods. They want to bump into their neighbors, but they want to do that in a place that feels not too overwhelming from a scale standpoint, that feels more connected to their community and feels like a place that they can call their hometown. And I think finally, to create that type of environment that truly is walkable takes a very different type of site design and architectural design than what we've traditionally seen in the suburbs. So it's sort of flipping what we think of a suburb is from a design standpoint on its ear a little bit. Because if you want a place that's truly engaging and walkable, it's just designed differently than what a lot of our suburbs are sort of built around and intend to do. It's bringing the streets up to the sidewalk. It's having generous sidewalks. It's not having the 30-acre park necessarily, although that's really important. It's about having that small scale pocket park where the arts festival, where the Friday night jazz concert, where the couple with the guitar can gather and play and create that sense of attraction, that sense of experience, and a stronger sense of community. And that's why the drive for walkability is really about creating the proper scale for the types of places that people want to be.
And I think that was a really great point, Eric. But one of the things that I want to add to that too is I think we need to keep in mind, the weather. I mean, we're down here in South Florida, which sometimes is a luxury because it's beautiful out right now while half the nation is buried in snow. But our summers are brutal. It's hot. Nobody wants to walk anywhere. And we have this awesome thing called rainy season since we don't get winter and summer. And so we get 60 inches of rain over the course of 6 months. And so it's also being able to plan for that. How can you provide shade and shelter along pathways and trails to make sure that it's being walkable? And that's definitely something that we found is really important to incorporate. And it was really a challenge for us really early on, as what we were starting to see was, well, yeah, it's walkable. We've created this engaging environment. And then it was like, well, what if nobody wants to walk? It's only a block, but nobody wants to do it. And so really paying attention to those types of features, making sure the buildings have awnings and things too, to kind of help shelter that, especially in the Florida sun or the Florida rain, has been really important in making Babcock specifically a success.
Wow, very interesting. I'm going to throw a phrase out there that I've seen in some reading about, new wave of suburban development. And it's the idea of designing through observing the way people interact. Amy, as long as you're already, you just finished up, what does that mean to you? And how do you think that's integral to the new suburban urban?
I actually have a good story. I told you my background. I'm a surface water engineer, and really when we got involved in the beginning of Babcock, we went and we did a bunch of tours, and I was really kind of confused in the beginning. Why are you taking the engineer with you? I don't know how that's going to help you. And they wanted to tour all of these walkable communities throughout Florida. And what I started observing was we would go from place to place, and it was a quarter mile or a half mile, and they say, okay, we'll bring the car around so I can go down to the coffee shop. Okay, well, bring the car around so I can go down and see the band show. And there were all of these great places, but they weren't willing to walk it. Yet they were saying, these are all beautiful and this is what we want to do. And it was like, guys, I think you're missing something. You're not willing to do what it is that you're trying to make everybody do. So as we had these conversations and we were working on Babcock, and Sheena, I think we have a slide if you want to share that, and I can talk a little bit more. But as we were working on Babcock, one of the things that we really tried to do were make different opportunities, because what we saw was we don't know how those people are going to interact once they get out here. And it could be different. It could be different than they interacted when we were out touring. And so we've tried to leave three different options, really. We've tried to focus on, and if you can look at the more engineered drawing, and I apologize because I'm an engineer. So, but if you look at the more engineering drawing, we tried to leave large pathways along the sidewalks and everything, and really towards those commercial corridors. So there's 10-foot sidewalks on both sides, very heavily landscaped to kind of create that experience that Eric was talking about. But we didn't want to stop there because we were afraid that people weren't going to get out and walk, and we were going to have the same situation that you see in a lot of walkable communities. So we also added several green space pocket parks, and all of those have a different experience, from being a sunset lookout to a garden to just an open overall park area, a little lakeside deck, some benches and random green areas, really, that were connected by much smaller segments of about a quarter mile each. So maybe if you can just go out of your home, go a 1/10 of a mile, get to one of these green spaces, well, it's not going to seem too far to go ahead and get to the next green space. And then it's not going to seem too far to get to the next green space. And before you know it, you end up right in the center of town anyway. And then the third one we really did is we left a lot of green spaces between the communities as we continued to develop, so we could figure out how we needed to connect to those in the future. And you can kind of see that on the map too, where on the edges of the residential subdivisions there, we've left green areas. Some of those were turning into sidewalks. Some of them we found that people haven't used at all. And some of them we are finding that we're just going to make a mulch path there, and that's what the people want. So we've kind of left that flexibility into what we're designing so we can create it around the way the people are actually living and embracing the community.
Well, that sounds, this is a great example, Amy, because what this starts to look at is how do you create what I call a village. As community designers, we're tasked with creating community in sometimes remote places, or sometimes in places that are right on the outside of cities. And how do we create the sense of village, or this place where people can walk and connect? And I was able to work on a recent project called Woodbury in Irvine, and we were maybe you can put that on the screen for us too, Sheenan, if you've got that. It's a little different project. It is a suburban project, but it is near urban areas, but it's not trying to be a city itself. It's really trying to be more of a village. In the upper right hand corner, you can see the plan for this community. And so about 4,200 homes, 636 acres, and it's about a dwelling unit per acre average on the gross scale, 14 different parks. And the reason why I wanted to show it as a great example for what the future I think could be for suburban development is it's all about scale. 600 acres is a really large area. And if you can connect it to the regional trail system like this community does on the left side, on the west side, connected to regional trails so that people can have that option to be able to ride their bikes for miles if they want. But then if somebody is, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, if somebody just wants to get outside, maybe they're a young mother and they just want to get out for a half hour and they don't want to walk more than maybe 100 feet. That the idea that you could have, as Eric mentioned, these pocket parks, these small little areas, which really bring the village feel home to your neighborhood, and that way you can really create this place for people to interact and place for people to gather, and so really it's about scale and it's about design detail, and that's what I love about this project is that as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, there's by using alley loaded product in this particular core area, we're able to create front porches and front areas for people to be able to come right down to the street from their home. And then in the bottom left corner, there's larger, this is a 20-acre core commons park area that has a school, has public parks, that has a swimming pool, amenity areas, and then has a connection to the retail village center, which is up in the upper right-hand corner of the project, and that really creates a sense of gathering for the whole community. So this project for me is a great representation of how to bring design into an efficient yet very, very livable and wonderful place to live for generations to come.
Thanks, Leo. And I love the idea. I think both of you touched on it really well of having flexibility as you go to allow for changes and to allow for you to react to the community and how they're receiving the project. Ryan, let's get you teed up. So I had read, according to ULI's Emerging Trends in Real Estate from this year, 2021, the Nashville area where you're located is considered one of the new boom towns. So what are some of the examples in that area that are showing some of the emergence of these trends that we're talking about today?
Sure. I think it started going back 20 plus years ago. The developments that come to mind in the Middle Tennessee area from a suburban standpoint are Providence out in Mount Juliet, West Haven down in Franklin, even Meridian down in Franklin. But thinking about some of the original live, work, play type developments, they were a bit more single family focused and sprawling. You're thinking of hundreds of acres, thousands of acres with a retail service area up front that not only serves that development, but also serves the local community surrounding it. I think over the last 20 years, what we've seen is a much more densified focus, as smaller land opportunities come available, higher density, more focused mixed uses on smaller land areas are kind of what we've seen evolve over the last 20 years. I think, Sheena, if you could pull up the images there, two examples I'll talk about are both located in the city of Franklin. They're down on the south end of Nashville. On the right here, you can see Berry Farms. Berry Farms is 600 acres. It's 3 separate parcels right at an interstate interchange with I-65. That development has roughly, it's over 3 million square feet of office, 1 million square feet of retail, a couple thousand residential units, and several hotels. And I think, each individual village kind of serves as its own development within a development. And I think within those areas, you create a central densified gathering space, which I think is so key in these mixed use hip urban suburban developments. So another example is up at the top left of this image here, which is north side of McEwen. This site's about probably a third of the way developed. It's 50 acres, has over 1 million square feet of office, over 100,000 square feet of retail and restaurants, over 1,000 residential units, and a couple hotels. And what you see here is a green village park immediately out in front of an office building. On each side of the park are a couple jewel boxes. One is a Jenny's ice cream. The other is a wine bar getting ready to open. And I think what you see when you have this densification of residential uses with a mixture of office and retail and restaurant and even hospitality is this central gathering space, whether it's during lunchtime for the office users or at happy hour for both the office users, surrounding residents, or even people that live down the street, having a place to walk down and spend some time with your colleagues or friends or family, spend some time out on the park, gather with your neighbors. It's a sense of lifestyle that I think, many people, whether you're a millennial or active adult, just a lifestyle people are seeking. And I think you've seen some of these suburban developments evolve into more dense mixed use developments like this. So I think in Middle Tennessee, we're seeing more of this. We're seeing these areas that have very specific retail users that they're promoting to bring to this development: restaurants, wine bars, ice cream, yoga studios, you name it, places for people to come gather with their friends and family.
Yeah, Ryan, there's two things that you mentioned that I want to highlight and reinforce. I mean, one, I think the master planned communities have been one of the most effective ways to create these type of environments, but it takes somebody who's got a lot of land and a lot of financial backing in order to make those happen, right? But the beauty of the master planned community is it started in most cases with the image for the residential, and it's about integrating the office and the retail and the open space into that. I think the challenges that our traditional downtowns face is they're already the center of commerce. And in so many cases, there's the resistance to actually bringing in the residential that is necessary to create these types of environments. I mean, as you noted, having that sort of central focus point, that public space, is so important to sort of have the center of being and the placemaking for how these environments get created. And in our downtown environments that are already there, we can't create that 14, 16, 18-hour life cycle that really makes the restaurants and the retails thrive without the level of intensity and density of housing that you're talking about. If you've just got office employees, we get traditional downtowns that roll up the doors at 6 p.m. You've got to have the office component that makes business work during the day and the residential component that makes business and restaurants and retail thrive at night. So having all of those components and then that primary focal point to make it happen is so important. And I think the other mistake that gets made a lot in trying to create these environments is starting too big. I think what we've seen in newer places that are being very successful with this type of development style is starting in a focused, concentrated manner. And yes, that means you're going to get pushback in terms of density and intensity and residential units, but you almost have to start small to create that critical mass that the momentum is created from in order to get things going that create that bigger picture.
Great. And actually, I'm going to start putting you all a little pressure on you with some audience questions, because I think there's a really good one that fits very well to some of the things that Ryan, you and Eric were both saying. So the question was, how do you balance the creative aspects of these projects that are necessary to ensure success with some of the more rigid or steadfast community engineering standards? Like, where do you toe the line so that you kind of are hitting both ends?
Yeah, so it's certainly a challenge. In many suburban markets, when you're talking about rigid standards, many utility providers require exclusive easements outside the right of way, and no other trees, streetscape, other utilities can be within that easement. So when we're trying to create these urban settings where you're bringing buildings to the right of way, and you have a lot of hardscape from the back of curb to the face of buildings, there's a lot of utility providers in the suburban markets that get very anxious when it comes to those type of proposals. So spending a lot of time up front with those utility providers, with the city, creating partnerships and gaining their trust and talking through how these utilities will be provided. I could get into some very detailed engineered dimensions when it comes to where utilities go with respect to right of way, but I'll spare the group with that today. But I think that's certainly something that is a challenge and takes time, creating those partnerships and working through those details with the providers.
Great. Any other add-ons to that question? I think it's an excellent one. But Ryan, you did a great job, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of the tactics and the elements that you want to create in these walkable centers are the very things that our suburban zoning codes don't allow for, right? They were the kind of things they outlawed because they were trying to keep the urbanity out of the suburbs. So in a lot of places, I think we've got to have a municipality or an authority that is willing to look at the holistic picture and create special zoning classifications or allow allowances in terms of those travel lane widths and those sidewalk widths and where the buildings are. It's not about having a setback, it's about having a build too. It's not about having parking minimums, it's about having parking maximums, because it's having too much space that actually starts to tear apart the environment that you're trying to create. So yes, we're trying to pack more things in a limited number of space, but that's what makes it vibrant. And we've got to have communities and municipalities that understand that vision and then are willing to work with developers and public-private partnerships in order to actually create them, because the code, frankly, in most places isn't going to allow them.
Good point. Let's keep going and shift gears a little bit into sustainability. How are some of the environmental challenges being transformed into sustainable planning and design opportunities? So how are we moving challenges into the opportunity bucket? The perception here is that these initiatives cost more money, but that people are willing to pay for them. Amy, do you think that's true?
I do, and we've definitely seen that out at Babcock. If we go back to even when I introduced myself, I said the whole idea of the community from the get-go was sustainability. And as we kind of started putting pen to paper and laying everything out, really what we tried to do is, and this even kind of builds on the last question a little bit as well, but really what we tried to do is, well, here's the 10 things we have to engineer. How do we use these 10 things in a sustainable type environment and everything? So we take a lot of advantage of where our runoff goes. We change the curb types as much as possible so we can capture that in open swales to convey that water a little bit better. It's also created floodplain storage for us. So as I said, in South Florida, we get 60 inches of rain in 6 months. So as we're trying to capture that, we need floodplain storage. So we've utilized these areas that during the wet season, which is the ridiculously hot season in South Florida also, so it's 95 degrees. So we've utilized those areas for floodplain storage. Instead of doing the traditional, we're gonna develop these ponds, stick them out in the very back, and then put a bunch of homes around them, and we'll call them an amenity. So we have all of these areas that now have trails and things through them. The trails are entirely usable through the dry season, which is more like 75 to 80 degrees when people want to be out and enjoying the weather. And we don't have the rain, and we're really just having floodplain storage. And so it's area that we would have used elsewhere and not been able to develop. We've also been able to use existing wetlands and things like that. So where we have environmental features coming in that we need to capitalize on. And then even to take that a step further, instead of the traditional ponds and backyards, we've started adding backyard wildlife areas. So we've actually created, they're similar to wetlands and things, and we've really seen the premiums on those properties against the preserves and trails or against those backyard wildlife areas, which is akin to a typical pond that you would see in South Florida in people's backyards, but planted. and not a deep hole in the ground. I mean, it does store a little bit of water, but a lot of plants and shrubbery in the back where you can see birds and things like that out there. And we've seen the premiums on those properties go up. So we've really amenitized those needs that we had, and it's really overall helped the sales and everything too.
Thank you. And a quick tack on, we had an interesting question from a sustainability standpoint that goes in a bit of a different direction, but the question, and Leo, this might be a good one for you. Many areas here in California are going with 100% electric projects due to fire damage and gas. Are you seeing ways to value engineer or design projects using 100% electric?
Wow, that's a great question. What a great goal that would be. I think there is a definite opportunity for developers to look at sustainable energy sources or different ways to create communities that are kind of off the grid, if you will. I'm here in Texas right now, and there is definitely a lot of thinking about that, about how people can try to be more sustainable, more off the grid, less reliance on electricity in that way. But with all the power outages, and it's definitely a great concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I do want to add to that just a little bit. Out at Babcock, we do have a 150 megawatt solar facility, which will be more than at build out, which will supply more than twice the amount of electric that the community is expected to use. But interestingly, what we've seen now that that's out there, and that's kind of a common theme in the community, is about 40% of the homes are also adding solar panels to their homes. They don't need it. The community is already run off of a solar plant. But they're adding those solar panels to their home. So I think it's more about creating that environment, even going back to what Eric talked about in the very beginning. It's creating that opportunity for them, and they're really buying in.
Great. How do public and private entities overcome traditional tools and methods in order to catalyze teaming for success on these reimagined developments?
Yeah, I think I got to jump in on that. So there's so many different public sector clients that we work with. And I think there's a couple of key pieces to it. I mean, I think, as I sort of briefly mentioned earlier, you've got to have a municipality that sort of has a vision for what it is that they want, for, who they want to be when they grow up, for what the center of the community wants to focus and be like. And I think so often where we've seen communities that have been successful, it's because they did a little bit of upfront thinking or visioning, or even as far as master planning, not to come up with all the rules and regulations necessarily, but to create some buy-in on what the vision needs to be. Because people don't talk in engineering and planner terms, but when they sort of see it, they know what it looks like and how it feels, right? So having a chance to go through a visioning and master planning process, I think, helps set that up. And then there are as many different ways to implement it as there are ways that we could think of. But the best examples truly have sort of this sense of public-private partnership. In a master plan community, the private developer can come in and sort of work on what she or he wants because they own the land, and can sort of barter a little bit with the municipality. In our traditional downtowns, it really has to have that collaboration of a public sector that has a vision, and isn't throwing it onto the private sector to implement, because we've already mentioned there's code problems, there's regulatory problems, there's financing problems. It has to be bringing that vision to the private sector, and then finding the right private sector investor and developer who also believes in that vision and is capable and interested in making it a reality. So I think vision and partnership, and from time to time, a little bit of a dose of reality in terms of that investment finance part and what it really takes in order to get these projects bankrolled and invested in and built. And then again, it's sort of throwing the rule book out a little bit and looking at the tactics and the strategies that are necessary for these places to be walkable, to be vibrant, to be experiential. Because you can't create that in a cookie cutter mode. It's different for every community, because the elements are different, the market's different, the history is different, and you got to buy into that.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that as well. I know, especially in the suburban market, the car is such a focus and something that goes into almost every decision. How are we going to park it? Where do we park it? How do we provide accessibility? And when you have these mixed use developments in a suburban market, you're relying on not only the development itself, so the office users, the residents, hotel guests, to provide that vibrant community. You're also expecting folks from the suburban market to drive in to visit the restaurant, the retail, and the open space park areas. So I think when you're thinking about parking and you have these mixture of uses in these type of developments, having the flexibility to provide a shared parking approach to how we handle parking. And on many of these densified suburban developments that are heavy mixed use focused, you have parking decks and structured parking. So being able to balance the high minimum parking requirements that we're used to seeing in these suburban markets with a more mixed use densified development, and being able to take an approach like the ULI shared parking guidelines and implementing those into a suburban market that may have never experienced that before, and trying to work through those details and digging into the different mixture of uses and how that's parked, I think is an important role as well of working through these mixed use developments.
Let's stay on parking for one minute. We had an audience question about how autonomous vehicles and ride sharing services might be changing strategies on parking. And Ryan, I think you'd have some feedback there. And then Amy, I'd be interested in some of the shuttle work that's been happening at Babcock Ranch too.
Yeah, I think at a minimum, the one thing that we are trying to incorporate into every development is how do you provide those pickup and drop off areas for ride shares? I think that's, whether it's hotel, office, a multifamily, you name it, on a regular basis, you have folks coming in to pick up and drop off for those ride shares. So providing that safe environment and a place to pull off and pick up and drop off, I think is important. I think the autonomous vehicle side obviously gets a lot more complicated and has to pull out our crystal ball a little bit and look a little further into the future. But it's certainly something that needs to be considered. So when you're planning for a development, today, assuming that autonomous vehicles continues to become more and more of a impact to our daily lives, how can we take some of these areas that we're currently proposing parking for and use those parking fields that may not be used 20 years from now and be able to redevelop a site? So not only thinking about the development and master plan that we're trying to implement as engineers today, but also thinking out, 15, 20, 25 years, how do we use some of these fields and some of these parking areas to further densify as the development progresses?
And then what I was going to add is really interesting to your point too, Ryan, is we really have tried to incorporate the autonomous vehicles from the very beginning. It was something that the whole team was really passionate about, and making sure that there were opportunities out there for autonomous vehicles, which has been really exciting to be part of. So what they've really started out there is currently there's 2 autonomous shuttles out there, and the community is continuing to grow. It's not even 10% developed at this point, but there's 2 autonomous shuttles. They're in the process of developing an app in addition to it. The shuttles have a regular route that they run, but they're also in the process of developing an app. So on the app, you'll just be able to call it to come out to your house and pick you up and take you where you need to go. So it's a rideshare type process, but in an autonomous vehicle that all of the community is allowed to partake in. So it won't leave the community. It also doesn't have its own special roads or anything either. It just travels on the regular roads with everybody else. and get you to where you need to be. So it's essentially a autonomous ride share for the entire community.
Very cool. Let's transition to mobility. I feel like we're already almost there, so let's keep going. Mobility, creativity, and creating access equity. What are some important lessons learned related to planning access in the new suburban urban community? What are some central business district amenities that urbanized suburbs are incorporating or are even looking to improve on? And are there any challenges? Let's start with Ryan.
Yeah, I'll jump in and take a stab at that one. I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think when you're looking specifically at a mixed use development, I think the retail uses are very important. They have to be authentic. They have to be places that not only serve that dense mixed use development, but also bring in folks from the community. So, a perfect example, and I touched on this earlier, is Northside McEwen. They have a yoga studio, they have a coffee shop, they have a wine shop, they have ice cream, they have several restaurants. So I think providing those places where people want to come, they come on a regular basis and gather with their families, gather with their friends, gather with their colleagues, creates that sense of community and just gathering space that energizes and provides that vibrance of a community. So I think from a central business district amenity standpoint, I think those are key components to try to bring to these densified developments to provide that vibrance that Eric touched on earlier.
Yes, and another exciting type of suburban urban work, if you will, are brownfield sites. Not everything is a greenfield these days, for sure. But going back into a suburban part of the city, that is, there's a project in Reno called Park Lane. It's an old mall that's been torn down for at least 15 years, and just really tough on this community around it. But now it's under construction, and it's bringing in workforce housing, it's bringing in markets, it's bringing in uses that the community needs right there. And it's a fantastic way to bring access and mobility really down to an area where for many years had been neglected. And so part of our work is really looking for those opportunities. Infill into cities is, for me, a key component to creating successful cities as they grow and mature and change over time, and looking for those opportunities. They don't all have to be huge sites, but they are all very important.
Hey, we got a question. I think this is an interesting segue from the audience about, opportunities for this type of project, maybe in an area that doesn't have, ample greenfield opportunities. Is this transferable to a redevelopment or a reinvestment area?
Yeah, I think a lot of times one of the first things we do when we come into an area is sort of create this opportunity analysis. Because the opportunities are different in every community, whether those are physical opportunities or are financial opportunities. So I think when these types of walkable suburban developments really work, it's because they have a little bit of a sense of authenticity to them, that they actually fit within the region and the city and the town that they're positioned within. I mean, while some of the strategies are the same, what this looks like in Dallas is a little bit different than what it looks like in a Charlotte or in a Reston, Virginia, right? They have to take on the flavor of the community in which they're in. And so I think there are components like some sort of central gathering space that are absolutely vital to making these things work. But the size of that space, the character of that space, how it's programmed might be very different from community to community. And I think we've seen examples where we've been able to weave that into the fabric. I think we've seen examples like Ryan referenced, I think, where there was the old aging retail center or grocery store that needed to be redeveloped. And, that redevelopment and repositioning the parking lot was an opportunity to create the green space. We've seen examples where downtown, frankly, picked up and moved in some communities, that there was a railroad and the town was so small, the land they had to work with wasn't enough to create the environment they wanted. So they moved a couple 100 feet across the railroad tracks to where there was an opportunity to reposition land. So I think it looks very different in different communities. And while there are common elements, it has to fit the particular situation of the place that it's in.
Great. Okay, so we talk a lot about millennials, but there's this other really large group. I call them the active adults, but they're also known as baby boomers, and those retiring roughly between 2020 and 2030. The retiree population is expected to grow by over 17 million. Are they also looking for this type of an experience, something that's more of a lifelong community?
I'd like to show a quick example of one of my recent projects, again in California, but Essentia is a good example of, I think, again, the future for this kind of thinking. People who are retiring don't want to be necessarily put in retirement communities necessarily, and Essentia, the developer on this project, took a lot of chances and was very progressive in their thinking about how to integrate age qualified with millennials, just those two core populations. Over 40% of the residents in this community are age qualified. There's 27 homes and 18 neighborhoods, about 800 acres on this community. And as I was a master landscape architect on this project, and programming was critical to each of these neighborhoods, and finding ways to integrate the populations of the community, which a lot of the retirees wanted to be able to be part of a family life of kids, and so there's actually opportunities for example, in this community, it's call it an agri-hood living. There's a farm to table farm in the middle of the community where some of the retirees can help the kids learn how to plant plants, and they can support the K through 8 school, which is in the middle of the community as well, and really create a lot of synergy between those different communities. And there's also programming that's only for the adults. There's for example, this is one of the first homeowners associations that I'm aware of in California that actually has a full bar at the pool, so that you can have a beer and watch your kids play if you want to. And so there's a lot of really interesting programming that allowed a lot of synergy and a lot of attraction for all the different age groups, to create opportunities for people who are retiring to really live well too. And I just would mention that this community is probably a good candidate for the well community standards that are the certificates, things that are out there. The neighborhood, the LEED ND kind of standards. It's really very innovative in that regard as well.
So, and one of the things I really wanted to add to that about Babcock is just to kind of step back a second. You need to realize where Babcock is placed, and it is the oldest county in all of Florida. I just looked it up to confirm that still is actually true. The average age in Charlotte County is 59 years old. And so it's almost entirely retirees. And so as we were doing this, it was, well, how do we do it not to totally alienate the millennials? And one of the things we've really seen out there is it's a 50-50 mix. And I live out there as well. And, just to kind of share a story that I saw the other day, we were out in the band shell and they had a bunch of like yard games and everything. So like yard Jenga and cornhole and everything else. And these young kids came up to this older couple and said, "Is it okay if we play next to you?" And they're like, "Yeah, no problem." And then afterwards, when the older couple was packing everything up, the kids were like, "Well, let me help you." And they helped pack up and everything. And I think really having that blend and being able to provide those types of environments has really made a big difference. and how that community is coming together and everything. And I think one of the things that really made that successful, especially in an area that does have such an old age group already, was, I mean, Babcock's first CO was their school. It's a charter school that's based, it's a project-based learning school, and it really started attracting those people and making sure that the right mix was really involved in the community early on.
Yeah, I think one more thing to throw in here, Jessica. I think while we're talking about populations, you know, I do think the design of these places, because there is such an emphasis on open space and walkability and public space, the design of these places is somewhat inherently more equitable than what we've seen in places that have been designed in the past that are designed in a way to take people apart from each other rather than put people together. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't factor in, though, the fact that because these places are so desirable and the demand for them is so much higher than the supply, it does mean that financially right now, these types of developments are pricing a big part of the population out of them. So I think the equity story is still one that very much is one that we're working on and is yet to be told, in terms of designing places that are more equitable, that are at transit-oriented densities in many places, that have residents who are anti-transit, that need multifamily and a diversity of housing price points to really truly reflect their community. But there's folks that are not on board with that. So I think there are still challenges, but ultimately I do think that this type of development style is created in a way that does create more of an opportunity for equity, but we need the public conversation and the strategies behind it to truly make it equitable from a financial standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And Eric, you probably didn't even know, but we had several questions about equity and access given the high demand in these types of communities and often the price premium associated with them. So thank you for proactively answering that question. We do have a couple other things out there, but we want to be really cognizant and respectful of your all's time. And we are coming up very quickly. This went by in a blur, but very quickly on 1 o'clock. I want to thank each of our panelists. I know you certainly gave me a lot to think about. And I know that we could certainly nerd out over this all day long, and we can catch up after the fact and talk some more. But this was really great. If we didn't get to your question, we got kind of a rush at the end of very well thought out questions that we would want to cover. Have no fear. We're going to wrap up some loose ends and kind of address some of the remaining questions as a follow-up. So Sheena has just put up some information on how you can get to our Perspectives webpage, where there will be the recording of this webinar, contact information for all the panelists, as well as any follow-up materials. And we'll get to some of those questions that we didn't quite hit today. And so we encourage you all to follow the link. I believe anybody that's registered will also get a link in their email. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and we'll see you in the suburbs.